Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about something today that's been on my mind for a while, really since the start of the season. So I love doing power rankings. I love ranking teams and all that. But this year has been kind of tough because there's a lot of mediocre teams. There's a lot of teams that can look pretty good one night and then pretty iffy the next, and their opponents are doing the exact same thing. So on this side of the board are the teams that I think we can agree are off to great starts, 700 points percentage or higher. So the Jets at the top at 909. I don't expect them to stay that high. Minnesota at 800. The Canes 778, along with the Washington Capitals, who of course are playing against each other. The New York Rangers at 750. The Florida Panthers at 708, and Dallas at 700. These are ridiculous numbers that have to come down. But because these teams are all playing so well and their records are so good, it will kind of suppress the records of other teams. It's just how that works. And it feels like, and I haven't done the research into this, but it feels like there's less overtime and shootouts than normal so far this season. And I think that's led to more teams being 500 or under. Half the league is 500 or below, which should be the case. That shouldn't be a surprise. But usually in any given season, it's like a handful of teams, maybe a half a dozen, that are below the NHL 500 mark. But this season, not the case. And then over here are four other teams we could argue have had mediocre runs that are not at 500 or lower. And don't worry, Calgary fans, I'll explain it. I'm not saying the Flames have been mediocre. We'll get there. So the Ottawa Senators are 5-5. Their wins have come against Florida, LA, Tampa Bay, Utah, and St. Louis. And I wanted to look at the teams these guys have beaten because in some cases it might be a little more revealing, just a little bit. In the case of the Ottawa Senators, they've beaten Florida, LA, Tampa Bay. All teams have made the playoffs last year. Utah and St. Louis are both on this board. LA's not on this board. I considered putting them on this board. And I mean, I could still make a justification for LA being on this board. But I do think that with Ottawa, and I mentioned this last night too, they've lost against some pretty darn good teams. I think they'll figure it out. I'm actually pretty confident in the Sens right now. That may change, but right now. So they're 5-5, but I think it's a strong 5-5. Then you got the Oilers at 5-1. Their wins have come against Philly, twice against Nashville, Pittsburgh, and Detroit. All teams that are on this board. So the Islanders have not had a win against a team that is not in this mediocre range. But we know they're without McDavid for a couple of weeks. It feels like they're turning it around after a slow start. I don't think the Oilers are going to be mediocre this year. I'd be very surprised if they stayed in that situation. The Anaheim Ducks are 4-4-2 because of Lucas Dostal. Also, they have 2 wins against San Jose and a win against the Islanders and a win against Utah. So when they're against teams that we can argue, yes, these teams are better than Anaheim, they generally haven't won. But they've got some points and they've stayed in games because Lucas Dostal has had one of the most remarkable starts to a season I can remember. The Seattle Kraken, 5-1. Their wins have come against Minnesota, so one of the teams on the board here, Nashville, Philly, Calgary, Montreal. So the other 4, all in that mediocre range, right? And so for Seattle, it's a matter of, finding the right mix. They missed the playoffs last year. They made the playoffs the year before. I think they're going to be in the mix for a wild card spot. I'd be very surprised if they fall well below 500 and off the pace. So I don't think they're going to stay at 500. I think they're going to be above 500 by the end of this month, at the very least, and probably above 500 within a couple of weeks here. But we'll see. The New York Islanders, 4-5-2. Wins against Buffalo, and that was last night. Colorado, Montreal, and New Jersey. So New Jersey, Colorado, those are a couple of teams that... And again, for New Jersey, I might have been able to make an argument for New Jersey to go on this board. I absolutely probably very well could have. So the Islanders have won some games here and there. They do regularly win when we don't expect it. But they've also had that scoring trouble. Barzal's out right now. They had a couple of defensemen get hurt last night. I don't know that the Islanders necessarily get out of this mediocre range soon. St. Louis, 5-6. They've had wins against Seattle, San Jose, the Islanders, Carolina, we're right there, and Toronto, who are not on the board. So 3 of their 5 wins have come against teams that are in this mediocre range. So for St. Louis, they have punched above their weight a couple of times this season. It's going to be harder without Robert Thomas, though, right? So my guess is they stay in this mediocre range for a while. Colorado, well, everybody's hurt. Any Avs fan will tell you that, usually to start a conversation. Hi, how's it going, Bill? Well, all the Avs are hurt, so not great. But yeah, Colorado 5-6. Their wins have come against Anaheim on the board, San Jose on the board, Seattle's on the board. Utah's technically not in the mediocre range, but we'll talk about them a bit. And Utah were also on the board, which means Colorado's won games against teams that you can argue they should have beaten. And again, the 6 losses, one of those being against Chicago. We can have the discussion of how many injuries it takes for Colorado to become mediocre. I would say all of the ones they currently have made that happen. And then it's a matter of when do you get healthy. The other issue, too, being the goaltending. Now, Annanen's been good, but you have to have 2 good goaltenders. And the risk becoming you could overplay Annanen in the case of, trying to get wins and being desperate for wins. So you need 2 good goaltenders. Detroit's 4-5-1, their wins. 2 of them against Nashville, 1 against the Islanders, and 1 against New Jersey. Again, I could have argued for New Jersey on this board. But for Detroit, I do still have some hope that they can turn it around this season. They don't have any more games against Nashville. That's troubling because they're only 2-5-1 against the rest of the NHL so far. Philadelphia's 4-6-1. They were expected to be in that rebuilding phase. Their wins have come against Vancouver, Minnesota, Boston, and St. Louis, and they're going to start a game against Boston in about 5 minutes' time here. So Philadelphia could win another one today. The expectations not being very high, but wins against Vancouver, Minnesota, and Boston tell you they're going to be tough to play against at the very best. Again, I'm not getting into how the team won. Some of these wins are going to be shootout and overtime, but just the fact they get those 2 points I wanted to have up on the board. And so for Philadelphia, Tortorella's going to keep them working. Boston's also 4-6-1, as we've got some teams here at 4-6-1. Boston's wins against Montreal, LA, Colorado, and Toronto. So in terms of teams on the board, 2 of them, again, I could have made the argument for LA. People are going to say, hey, you can make the argument for Toronto. Yeah, probably. A lot of mediocrity to go around right now. Parity in the NHL's eyes. It's felt very mediocre, not parity-like. So for Buffalo, 4-6-1, their wins have come against Florida, Chicago, Dallas, and Detroit. It is interesting that Ottawa and Buffalo both have wins over Florida, who have looked really, really good recently. But, again, it shows that anybody can beat anybody on any given night. But Buffalo's also beaten Dallas. So Buffalo can definitely be better than this 4-6-1 team that they have. I also wanted to explain Thanos because he wiped out half of the universe and half of the NHL is right now in that mediocre range. Montreal has a 4-6-1 record as well. Their wins against Toronto, Ottawa, St. Louis, and Philadelphia. So 3 of the 4 on the board. And again, you can make the argument for Toronto. Sure, go right on ahead. Pittsburgh, 4-7-1 with wins against Detroit, Montreal, Buffalo, and Anaheim. So all of them teams that are in this mediocre range. Nashville, 3-6-1. And in the case of Montreal is expected to be rebuilding. In the case of Pittsburgh, they were supposed to be trying to stay in that race for the playoffs. Now there's got to be some panic because you've got an old team there and the expectations were higher for this season. Then you got Nashville. The expectations were high. They have not reached them. They're 3-6-1. Wins against Boston, Chicago, and Columbus, and all 3 of those wins in a row. So we'll see if that's the highlight for them or if they're able to, start getting some wins strung together soon. But Nashville's in some measure of trouble. The good news for Nashville is you're not alone. And San Jose, 3-7-2. Their 3 wins have been their 3 most recent games against Utah, LA, and Chicago. So again, I could have had LA on the board on that basis, couldn't I? And Chicago, of course, the only team beneath them in the standings with less points at 3-7-1. Their wins against Edmonton, who are right there, San Jose right here, and Colorado right here. So a lot of mediocrity to go around. And then just for the sake of pointing out, there are other mediocre teams, and again, I could have put Toronto and LA on this board, well over half the league. But Vancouver's 4-2-3. They've only won 1 game at home. I could not let Vancouver's points percentage necessarily keep them off this board because they've only won 4 out of 9 games. Utah, 5-4-2. decent start. They fell off a bit. The reality is they're only one game above this 500 mark, and they've won 5 out of 11 games. So to me, there's still some mediocrity there. It's why they had to go out and get Olimata for their blue line. Columbus is 5-4-1. I think Columbus is playing well, but I had to have them on the board as a 5-4-1 team that could go either way. And so while they don't qualify as being in this half of the league that's mediocre, they're not that far above that mark either. I hope Columbus keeps it together. I hope Elvis has a great season and they make the playoffs, honestly. And Calgary 6-4-1. They got off to the really good start. Then they fell off a bit. Last night they beat New Jersey. Will Calgary find themselves on the mediocre side of things sooner rather than later? Odds are probably. But again, with this many teams that have been struggling, there may be an opening. And that's the thing. There may be openings this year for teams that have maybe 90, 91 points to make it into the playoffs, whereas usually would be 96 to 100 points to get in. So should be an interesting season in that there are so many teams one could argue is mediocre. So the question I have for people watching this is simple. Which of the teams that are mediocre are most likely to not be mediocre by the end of the season? I'll pick 4. My 4 would be Edmonton, Colorado. If I'm going to pick 4, Edmonton, Colorado. I'm going to say Ottawa. I'm going to go ahead and say Ottawa. That may age like milk, I'm aware. And I'll say Nashville turns it around. And Nashville pulls themselves back up to potentially a playoff spot. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. But that's where we're at. Half the league with very mediocre records. I'm okay with it. It's just, it looks odd because I'm so used to so few teams actually being 500 or under because we have so many games go to overtime. There's so many 3-point games that both fan bases can walk away and go, well, we won that game. And the other fan base is going, well, I mean, we didn't win, but we got a point, so we played pretty well. So that's the NHL thing. And this year, it's not really turning out that way so far. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I will talk to you again soon.